Hello, welcome back to Learn It from a Layman. I'm Carl Christensen. Once again, solo podcasting. A lot of my co-hosts are off and busy with various other, life tasks. So I'm coming to you to discuss a few things that interest me and hopefully you'll find interesting as well. So today we're going to be talking about second language acquisition. So in the case of second language acquisition, I have a little bit of knowledge here. So I both taught a second language. So I was an instructor for a little while in Dutch. And I also have had obviously the role of a learner. So my native language being English, I learned Dutch as a 19-year-old, and then since then have learned a few other languages to some level of basic ability. So we're going to talk all about second language acquisition, both what languages to acquire, how to acquire them, strategies, studies, testing, all those types of things. But I wanted to start with just discussing what languages people choose to learn. This almost seems like kind of an American problem. If that's fair to say. It's not really the case that in most other countries, at least in my experience, if you don't ask yourself what second language you want to learn because there's a automatic second language to learn, right? They're either the neighboring country or in a lot of cases it's English because that's kind of the lingua franca of the world at the moment. But the idea of being able to pick any arbitrary language and saying, oh, this is the one I really wanted to learn, that is kind of a privilege that people that need language for functional reasons don't really address. So I'm going to discuss it, but I know that it's not always necessarily the most relevant question. A lot of people, you're coming to this podcast about second language acquisition to learn about what ways to tackle it, and we're going to get there. So don't jump off yet. But as far as picking a second language, because I think a lot of people, at least in the United States, and that's where most people listen to this podcast still, they jump in and they jump in high school, or maybe even a little earlier than that, and there's only a couple languages offered. And so, be it Spanish or German or French or something along those lines, offered in most junior high or high schools in the United States. Those languages can be incredibly useful, especially Spanish. But I want to establish some criteria here based to actually make a informed decision on what language to learn, as opposed to just this is the one that my parents told me to, or this is the one that my friends are learning, or for whatever other reason. So as far as establishing some criteria, I guess my first criteria is the one that most, like I said, in other countries are using, and that's usefulness. And usefulness can be broken down into a lot of other subcategories as far as trying to figure out which, how to rank languages based on usefulness. The first one, of course, being proximity. If I am learning Korean and I live in the United States and I've never been to Korea, and my only interaction with Korean people is occasionally I see a Korean family in the supermarket, that's not exactly going to be useful to me, right? If I have no family members, no travel plans, no particular tie-in to the culture or whatever, the idea that I'm going to learn Korean because I think it looks cool is not going to usually prove to be enough to get me to the finish point. So proximity can be one to look at. Obviously, I live in Southern California, very close to Mexico. So a lot of Spanish speakers around here, and therefore it makes sense to learn some Spanish. So that's one criteria as far as one way to kind of judge usefulness. Another one would be how many L1 speakers or well, I guess there's two questions. So L1 speakers, so that's your first language speakers of a language, right? So if I decide I want to learn some kind of small language, let's say I'm going to actually pick on the Danish a little bit here. So let's say I want to pick Danish as a language I want to learn. Um, Denmark is a great country, and as a slight aside to pull us quickly into what I usually give us an update on our user base. I'm a software guy, so you can forgive me the terminology slip here. Our listeners, we've got listeners all over the world, including in Denmark. However, we don't have a lot of listeners in Denmark. We can tell based on the stats that we get. Um, my name is Carl Christensen. If you Googled Carl Christensen, like the Danish flag would come up, like the Danish national anthem would play in the background. Um, I talk about a Danish name, Carl. All right, Christensen. I know that a Christensen recently scored a goal for the Danish national team in the Euro Cup. I mean, come on, like Denmark needs to represent here, and I know I don't speak Danish, and we're going to talk about that in a second here, but. I know that the vast majority of Danish will bring us right back into second language acquisition here, away from our listeners. The majority of Danish people, there are millions of people in Denmark that speak Danish, obviously, but the majority of those people speak English as well. So not only is it a question of how many speakers are there, so there are millions of Danish speakers, but going beyond that to how many of them are monolingual. You know, native L1 speakers of that language. So if I chose Danish, maybe that's really useful if I go to Denmark, only in as much as I'm very fluent in it, right? But if I go and I've got some passable Danish, and I go into or a restaurant to order, or if I go to a museum or whatever, and I'm struggling along with my Danish, I guarantee the tour guide or the restaurant worker, whoever it is, just starts talking to you in English. I actually visited Iceland here a number of years ago for a academic conference, and I generally, when I go to another country, I at least spend a little bit of time trying to learn the language. And in the case of Iceland, for whatever reason, it just didn't register for me to try to learn a little bit of Icelandic. And so I went there just feeling bad. And I remember my first interaction with, I went up, I was at a gas station, I was going to go order buying something anyway. And I go up and I look kind of hesitantly and ashamedly at the employee there and say, English? And she says, yes, of course I speak English. Because of course she speaks English, because in all of these Scandinavian countries, they not only speak, so in Iceland they speak Icelandic, they speak Danish, and they speak English, and they speak all of them probably to a degree to which most people in the United States don't even have a great control over their first language. Once again, looking at usefulness, L1 speakers, just the number of people that live in a country isn't the only thing you got to look at. You have to look at how many of those people speak only that language, or at least not another language that you speak, if that makes sense. So, all right, let's move on. So one last thing about usefulness is another way to measure usefulness is just economics, right? Our last podcast, go back and listen to that one. As far as money and supply and demand and all those things, if there is a lot of money to be had, economic opportunity to be had, if you can speak a particular language, say Japanese or Chinese or some Chinese. Obviously, there are a lot of reasons to learn that as far as usefulness goes, but economics can play a big role. So Germany is a massive economic engine as well. So that could be a reason to learn German, while a lot of the German population also speaks English. The ability to speak some fluent German might help you if you want to get a job in Germany or something along those lines. All right, so other reasons are how to rank what language you want to learn. So family ties, obviously. If your grandma speaks a particular language, or your grandpa, or whatever it is, or like myself, your name is very ethnically from one country. Maybe you feel a draw to learn a particular language. I'd love to have enough Danish listeners that I feel like I have to learn Danish. I have obviously family history in Denmark. I don't have any current family that lives there. So I don't have any reason to learn Danish for that for family ties reasons. And then the last consideration, one of these criteria to rank how to pick a language to learn would be how leverageable is it? Can I use this to leverage to learn other languages, right? So if you wanted to learn Latin, for example, right? How useful is Latin? Well, not, right? Like, of course it's not useful. Nobody speaks Latin. Maybe if you could time travel, right, it would be useful. But nobody speaks Latin, so why would you learn Latin? Well, Latin the is the precursor to a lot of the Western European languages that we have right now. So obviously Italian, Spanish, Romanian, all of these Western Indo-European languages share a lot of root words and sometimes syntax and those types of things with Latin. So while if you learn Latin to some fluent ability, maybe you've gone too far, some ability to recognize Latin structures and Latin words and Latin vocabulary probably could be very leverageable across lots of different languages, where the cognates are words that exist in both languages that share a common root in a parent language, right? So language families, you can trace them back to hundreds of years to where the language is split off. Different groups of settlers went one way and then another went another way, and then that's how you get French versus Spanish, or that's how you get German versus Dutch. And so tracing your cognates in different languages can be as simple as saying, how recently was the language split off, and the more recently it happened, the more cognates you're generally going to run into. And cognates are obviously wonderful. If you've ever learned another language and you're looking at the language and saying, "Oh, I recognize a lot of those words already," then you've obviously got a great start. And we're going to talk about that. So let's move on from which language to learn. So hopefully, obviously, you have a clear idea going in with your eyes wide open as far as why you're learning the language that you're going to learn. And let's look at where to start. A lot of options out there, right? Always have been, and now some people think it's sufficient to just have the resources at your fingertips, like a Google Translate or some machine translation thing, or something along those lines. However, that's going to function in a lot of cases, but it doesn't give you the personal satisfaction. It also doesn't work in all situations, right? If you can't have a conversation with someone on the street, you can't along those types of lines, at least not very well, if you're trying to pass it through some phone app that is translating it or interpreting it live for you. So it's worth it to still learn that language. And so where do you start? Well, you do need resources. So besides machine translation, which can be a resource to learn a language, right? It can certainly be one of the resources you use. There's phone apps and those types of things. But as far as the linguistic, let's take it down to the linguistic level, besides resources, but what do you need to have available to you at the linguistic level? So if you've listened to these podcasts in the past, I've talked a lot about language. I'm a linguist by education, a computer scientist by trade. So I am very aware and grateful for the phone apps and those types of things, but the linguistic structure that you can get to learn a language, I think, is invaluable. So, and I've mentioned this before as one of my crusades in the past. Something I'd love to do is have everyone learn some basic level of linguistics, because trying to learn a second language, if you truly are just monolingual and then jumping in to learn a second language, it can be incredibly daunting and overwhelming for a lot of people. And so getting some basic structure of language, knowing what syntax means, knowing what morphology is, and phonetics and phonology and semantics, all these different parts of a language and how they structure a language, and how understanding that can better help you put a framework around how to learn a second language. So if I say, oh, you need to understand the grammar. Well, you know what grammar is, right? That grammar and syntax, not quite synonyms, but certainly close, as far as saying you need to know the word order. You need to know how words um, can be put together in a particular sentence, those types of things, right? Morphology, the different word endings, be that case. In a lot of languages, you have something called case, and that's in some languages that's incredibly complicated for not just masculine and feminine, but accusative, objective case, all these other cases where you have, and if those words don't mean anything to you, right, then when you're starting to learn Latvian or whatever, and they have something like 9 cases, when they said the objective, I don't know all the cases in Latvian or Lithuanian or whatever it is, but they have lots of cases from what I remember. And if you don't know what some of these linguistic words mean, it it's like learning a new language to learn a new language, right? And so getting that under your feet right away, knowing what some syntax and morphology and phonology words are, like what an object is in a sentence and what a subject is in a sentence and what prepositions are and how they relate, because different languages use prepositions in kind of different ways. You kind of need to go back to your grammar school roots in order to have a better structure on language, in order to better acquire it. So that, I think, that is important. I really do. If, however, you don't have that and you now have a limited amount of time to learn a new language, you kind of just have to press forward, right? If you don't have any background in very much in grammar and or any in linguistics, like most people out there, then you have to talk about what is you've got to find your very strong motivation, and that's a big thing in second language acquisition fields. Is they studies have been done to look at, obviously, if you have a strong motivation to learn language, your success at learning that language incredibly is very high, right? Of course it is, because if I'm motivated because I am dating someone that speaks that language, guess what? I'm going to do a good job because I have a very real reason to learn that language, and my motivation is high. If it's for a job, my motivation is high, right? If it's just for some passing school trip and or study abroad or something like that, maybe my motivation is temporary and I know that, right? So all of a sudden when I'm spending an hour learning Chinese, I'm like, well, I could be doing anything else, and so all of a sudden my motivation is lacking. You need that motivation, you need that interest in order to put it in put in the time, because all language, however you structure it, however you get your resources, be it, I think a good dictionary, a good app, a good book, I mean actually like a novel, and just reading in that language, breaking it down, I think that's important. All those things will be insufficient if you don't have a good motivation to do it. So get yourself that motivation. If you don't currently have it, find a way to get it, right? Try to make a friend that is bilingual or in that language, and or plan a long trip to go there, and then shove yourself in a situation where you have to use it. Volunteer at if you're learning a language just for your area, go and volunteer and to be like, oh, I'll be able to help in a month, and then all of a sudden you've given yourself this hard deadline of, I need to go down to help with this group of refugees or whatever in a month, and I don't know a word of this language. I need to go learn that. So get yourself that motivation and give yourself a hard deadline. Okay, so besides resources and motivation, and then just kind of a base linguistic set of words and structure, you have to ask yourself where you want to start. As far as most people are mostly interested in learning to speak a language. That's got the most utility as far as what perception goes, at least. But once again, evaluate your use case. If you're learning Chinese for a job, are you going to really be speaking with people in Chinese? Are you going to be writing and reading Chinese? Because those are very different. Especially in Chinese or those types of languages where you're no longer working with a traditional alphabet, either Cyrillic or any of those alphabets are far more acquirable by those native language speakers of English, or versus a kind of a pictographic or symbolic language where you have characters, and those don't mean anything to you, right? Go try to learn Chinese, or um, those things are significantly more challenging. And so, if your use case is where do I need to learn to read and write, well, maybe that's where you start, as opposed to trying to learn how to say, where's the bathroom in Chinese. Maybe you need to start with learning to write the characters, learning to read the characters and recognize them. Um, because you can learn that independent of speaking, right? My dad, for example, learned in college, he learned German, and he said he actually learned it pretty well, but he actually never learned how to speak it. He only learned how to read it and write it. Uh, they never were required to speak it, and so that's what he did. Um, so once again, use case, motivation, all those things come into what aspects of a language am I learning. So another place to evaluate where am I starting is, I think a lot of people think that in order to learn a language, they've got to learn it like they did when they were a baby, right? When they learned their first language, is just jump in and I'll be able to figure it out. Well, I mean, we could talk about the science of it, and there's, immersion is useful, and we'll come back to that here in just a minute, actually. But it's it it is the case that you're no longer a baby. If you're listening to this and you understand me, you're not a baby, right? And learning a second language is different than learning a first language, and that's okay. It should be different. And it also turns out that babies take years to learn a language, right? Um, so learning it like a baby would take a while. So give yourself a different structure. Immersion, just for the sake of immersion, is like driving down. If I drove down to the middle of Guadalajara and got out and tried to interact, good luck, right? That's not going to happen. Now, immersion, as far as going to an immersion school, right? That's a whole different set of principles, and then that we're going to be talking more about the learning strategies and language acquisition strategies here in a second. So it's okay to learn the second language differently than you did your first language, and go in knowing that. Don't try to just, I'm going to listen to a podcast in Spanish, and you're not. You're going to fail miserably. You're going to get discouraged, and you're going to quit, because no, that's not how you're going to acquire the language. Now, as you work up, that can be a useful tool, right? That can be one of the things you do. Listen to a Spanish podcast, listen to Spanish radio, or whatever else it is. But it's not going to be the first thing that you do, and it shouldn't even be one of the early things that you do, because all it's going to do is intimidate you and discourage you. It should start off with very simply learning some basic vocabulary, some basic morphology, and that's your conjugations and those types of things, right? You need to learn how to conjugate verbs. You need to know how to structure sentences, and that's where you need to start, right? And that's obviously where the apps take you. But don't just skim by those things as if they don't matter. That they matter the most. All right, so learning strategies. We already started talking about immersion. So immersion schools are. I did not go to one, right? The way I learned my second language, Dutch, I went to. So I learned Dutch as part of a church service. Experience, a church missionary experience, and so I went and I learned Dutch in a relatively small amount of time. It was partially immersive, right? Our Dutch language instructors spoke Dutch to us a lot, but not exclusively, right? They were bilingual Dutch English as well, and so they did and could help us. And I'm guessing that's what you get in most most immersion programs, be it in elementary school or wherever they do them in different levels of schooling. I'm guessing that's what you get. But I did when I took a Dutch class at the university level when I later on. And our teacher there assumed, because we were a high level, 300 or 400 level, an upper level Dutch class, that we could all speak Dutch. And so at no point in that class the whole semester he spoke not a single word of English, right? It was just Dutch all the time, because that's what we should be expected to know and do. Um, at lower levels, it can help to interact a little bit in the L1, in my experience. So don't beat yourself up if you do need a little bit of explanation and not just pure immersion, right? Not right off the bat. Now it can be helpful as once again, one of the tools that you use. So if you are never being immersed into it, if all you ever are doing is talk, a Duolingo app or one of those types of things, then you're probably not getting sufficient exposure to what the language should sound like and how quickly the words really do get put together. And then when you hit the real world here after studying for 6 months on your phone, then you're blown away, right? So once again, these things have to be taken in the right order and the right amount in order to get the L2 acquisition as smooth as it can be, and it's hard work for everyone. So immersion is a important tool, but when you start learning a language, don't overdo it, I guess is my point. Okay, so other than that, other strategies. So there's these three discussed in L2. These three strategies discussed in some L2 research about informal language learning versus purposeful language learning versus formal language learning. And I've had exposure to all of these. I've been in the second language acquisition area. I've given you my background for a while, but informal is kind of just generally what. So I've been studying Chinese on my phone, the Duolingo app, and there are lots of different apps out there, right? Just kind of casually, right? And that's your informal. Like I'm just here and there picking up something. Purposeful, and that's one strategy of learning a language, right? It's not going to take you very far, but maybe you learn some phrases or whatever, and you go on a trip, and you can use that. Purposeful is I'm going to I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do this daily, I've got a certain amount of time I'm going to do it, I'm going to structure it in a particular way that I can work on my grammar, and I can work on, and apps can do that too, right? The different apps can help you in that way. So more than just informal, those can actually give you kind of a purposeful, direct strategy as well, as far as making sure that you have particular areas of the language that you're tackling, that you're building on vocabulary that you have and grammar that you've learned, so that you can put those together in a particular way with a given purpose. And generally, those you have a goal, right? You're trying to not just, I'm casually trying to learn this. Purposeful is I'm at the end I'm going to take a test, or at the end I'm going to go do a study abroad experience, or whatever that might be. You have a specific purpose in mind, and you are taking this language learning in a more structured way. And then there's formal, and formal is I'm going to sign up for a class, or I've got certain hours set apart in the day where I study, and it generally does imply that I'm doing it with other individuals. I have a teacher, or I have someone that gives me constructive and useful feedback, and that is that one in my experience has the most success, right? Informal and purposeful. Informal, as you can imagine, generally you get what you get out of it, what you put into it, and it's usually not much, right? That's almost as bad as like high school Spanish. Purposeful is my dad learned Spanish, and he can speak Spanish reasonably well, and he did it without a class. He did it without, he just sat down and worked through a Spanish textbook and read and talked and did his best for over the course of a couple of years, and did pretty well. And he can communicate quite well, and he can speak quite well. His accent, I think, leaves a bit to be desired, but he succeeded. I guess the point of that is that he's the exception, not the rule. Generally, people that are doing it out on their own, either on a phone app or a textbook or whatever, and without a formal structure, even however purposeful they might be, the difficult nature of second language acquisition overcomes their motivation, and therefore they fail. So I do recommend, if you're coming into this, formalize it in a way. formalize it, get into a class, get into a group where you have accountability, right? And that's what formal second language acquisition offers you, is all of a sudden now you are accountable to someone. It's no longer at your own pleasure. It's now, okay, I actually put money up for this, or my teacher is going to yell at me, or whatever it might be. And so formal language learning is incredibly useful. I think there's a movie recently about, isn't there a kind of an indie movie about, this is where a co-host would be useful. I'm pretty sure there's a recent indie movie about language learning and learning a language over Zoom. Anyway, I don't remember the name of it, but that's the idea. Even if it's just that, even if you signed up for lessons online and you have a teacher that's teaching you, great, useful. All right, and then another, so strategy-wise, and this is more kind of at a high level, is a lot of learning strategies and a lot of apps and those types of things try to mix input and output, meaning you're both reading and listening and producing, speaking, writing, whatever it might be. And so you do have to be aware of those things, right? You need to not just listen and consume. You need to be able to produce. If you need to write, if that's one of the things that you're trying to learn how to do, you need to be able to do that as well. And so that will also kind of shape your strategies, right? The ability to spell words and be able to, that's very important, and you need to build that into your time if writing and reading are part of your desired outcome for the L2. If not, if you're just going for kind of oral fluency, then maybe all you need is the ability to conjugate the verbs, not the ability to spell them and know exactly how all of that works. It's just a question of, oh, I need to be able to put a verb with a noun properly. Whatever case they might take, I need to know that in as much as I need to speak it. If there are written forms that never get used in oral production, then not relevant to me, right? All right, so there are a lot of different strategies, and we could talk more about the second language acquisition research and different strategies that are employed as far as different amounts of production and translation involved, but we're not going to move into that as opposed to asking more of these layman questions. I think we once again try to specialize here in is how long will it take? Because if you've been listening to this podcast, you've been thinking, okay, yeah, maybe I want to do I want to learn a language, or I have wanted to learn a language, or maybe, this is something that you could find interesting if you knew how long it would take. But you've heard that learning a language is hard, and you know that certain languages are harder than others, and therefore you don't ever invest the time because you don't know what you're going to get out of it. So there are different ways to rank difficulty of languages and how long they might take for you to learn. And obviously it does depend on the learner, of course, and the amount of motivation that you have. But the Foreign Service Institute of Language gives you, puts out this ranking of difficulty for languages coming from English. So if my L1 is English and I want to learn another language, how difficult are these languages? And they categorize them based on different amounts of time that it will take you to learn, and put them in these different categories. So Category 1 languages, according to the Foreign Service Institute language difficulty rankings, are languages like Danish, Dutch, French, Italian, Norwegian, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, and Swedish. They estimate, and then they not just based on crazy out there guesses, but actually based on real world data and their the amount of time it takes for them to teach foreign service people these languages in a classroom setting. They estimate that it's going to take you somewhere between 24 and 30 weeks, or 600 to 750 class hours to reach a particular level of fluency. Speaking and reading proficiency that they need in order for you to be able to interact in those countries. So once again, Category 1 languages, Danish, Dutch, French, and from experience, they do rank French as slightly more difficult than those other ones that I mentioned, Italian, Norwegian, those ones. Having learned Dutch from English, it is relatively simple. Um, it is pretty straightforward, and so it's a good one to start with, in as much as it is an easy one to start with. But going back to the first thing that we talked about in the podcast is how useful is it? Well, there's a lot of Dutch speakers in the Netherlands. There is Suriname, where I lived, and go back and listen to that podcast because that one's a fun one. And there's also the Dutch Antilles. Afrikaans is very close to Dutch. So, however, a lot, and I mean a lot, of Dutch L1 speakers are also very fluent and very proficient in English. Honestly, most of the Dutch people that I know, if you didn't know they spoke Dutch, because you've interacted with them in English, then you certainly wouldn't know by talking with them, right? Like there's very little to no accent. They control English like a native, meaning they put sentences together perfectly. It's amazing how well the Dutch have learned English, right? And so while you could learn Dutch, and I think it's a great language, and I do speak Dutch to a pretty good fluency, it was far easier to do that in Suriname. It was easier for me to acquire Dutch in Suriname than would have been in the Netherlands, because in Suriname, most people there don't have as high a fluency in English. And so if I'm speaking them in Dutch, well, that's the only way we can communicate, generally. They speak, the Surinamese population sometimes, depending on obviously the level of education, they have some English proficiency, but not like those in the Netherlands. So, well, I had the opportunity to go and immerse myself and not really have the ability to fall back on English. Those of my peers that went to the Netherlands and spoke Dutch in the Netherlands, also doing church missionary work, they obviously, if 90% of the Netherlands, I think it's actually more than that, can speak fluent English, and you're struggling with your Dutch, they're going to want to speak English with you because they have things to do. Anyway, so those are Category 1 languages, however. So if you're looking at, once again, the amount of time that you need to put in order to learn a language to a particular fluency, and any of those languages that I just mentioned interest you, great, go for it. Matt, who's on this podcast a lot, and I believe will be on the next one as well. I think we're going to be discussing, hopefully, algebra. He speaks Romanian. That's a very useful one because, once again, while there are a number of Romanian speakers that speak English as well, a lot of those really are just monolingual Romanian. So taking that into consideration. And then Spanish, obviously, being the most useful of those relatively easy languages to learn from English because of just the vast number of Spanish speakers and also the proximity of those Spanish speakers to us in the United States. Category 2 languages, so these they estimated probably approximately 36 weeks to learn, or 900 class hours. Those are German, Haitian Creole, Indonesian, Malay, and Swahili. I think there are a few of those aren't particularly high on the level of public interest. Maybe I'm mistaken, but at least in the United States, not a lot of Swahili classes, not a lot of options there. But German, obviously one of the big ones. I took a number of years of German in high school. And that takes a while, right? German is more complicated when coming from English to learn than Dutch is, for example, even though Dutch and German are very close as far as vocabulary and those types of things. German has a case that we don't in English. Grammar is similar to Dutch, but still different enough that it's more challenging. But Category 2 language, Category 3 languages, this is when you start getting to ones that they say they take approximately 44 weeks to learn. So now you're coming up on almost a year, right, worth of learning time. That's 1,100 class hours, and these are Albanian, Armenian, Aramaic, let's say a couple of highlights here. There's a lot here. Finnish. Finnish is challenging, even though you'd imagine it's up there right by the other Scandinavian countries. You think, oh, well, Finnish shouldn't be that bad. It really is. It really is very different and very challenging. It's not in the same language family as any of the other Scandinavian languages, and so the morphology of Finnish is very difficult. That means the way they put word endings on words are very agglutinated. So you put a lot of different word endings on a single word in order to build meaning from it. And so it's very different than what we do in English and or those other Scandinavian languages like Norwegian or Danish. Then you something like Russian. Obviously, there you have the writing system as well. So now you're talking Cyrillic. So now you have to learn a different alphabet. And while it is an alphabet, not a arbitrary character system, it is a different alphabet, and so it's going to take some work to learn that. Greek as well, same type of thing, different alphabet, though maybe one you were slightly more familiar with, at least as this layman right here, me. I'm more familiar with the Greek alphabet, even though I've never learned Greek or Russian. I'm more cursorily familiar with the Greek alphabet, right? Because we use that in scientific things and versus Russian, where I don't have almost any exposure to Cyrillic. Anyway, lots of other languages here that in the Category 3 area, and then we get to the Category 4 languages, and these are the 88 weeks is what they estimate for learning these languages. 2,200 class hours. So good luck, right? Arabic, Chinese, and that's both Cantonese and Mandarin, and Japanese and Korean. And so these are the very challenging languages to learn. And I've taken Chinese at the university level, 3 semesters. I've spent some time in China, and I can interact to a very basic level. I once made a lady cry. I didn't mean to. I was trying to be nice. I was just having to decline she was offering me some tea. I didn't want it. I just tried to do it nicely. And apparently I said something. Anyway, I'm just saying these languages are different enough that if you don't get them right, you'll make someone cry. If you're trying to jump into Arabic or Chinese or Japanese or Korean, go in with your eyes wide open. Know it's going to take a long time. And if you're trying to read and write and all those different things, learning to write Chinese is challenging. Learning to recognize the characters is easier, obviously, than writing it. Writing, there's a particular order that you have to. Anyway, we won't go into that type of calligraphy stuff or whatever. Those are kind of the rankings of languages and how long it might take to learn those languages. So let's move on to a couple other things before we wrap up. What does it look like? What does language acquisition look like? Because maybe while you're going along, you're like, I don't even know if I'm making the right progress here. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing at this point. I've been doing my app for a while. I've been reading. I've been going to a class, and am I really at the stage of acquisition that I should be? So there actually are different, and this is based on the research, and second language acquisition is actually a class you can take in like linguistics and linguistics in college. So there's a whole class that you could study this, and we're trying to discuss it here in about 40 minutes. But there are 5 stages of acquisition, according to some, one of the theories about acquisition, the second language acquisition, and the first one is silent or receptive phase. So that's your first phase of language acquisition, and that's when you're just sitting back and kind of just drinking in, right? You're listening to the first words in Spanish, and you're hola, como estas, and you're not saying much. You're just learning some vocabulary, a phrase or two there or here, and you're just trying to take it in. So there's some argument as to in the research about whether or not you're actually silent. Your brain is constantly producing things, even if your mouth isn't, but you're at least not like verbalizing a lot. You say some vocabulary and some phrases. Second phase is early production, and this is when you start so now you've got a few vocabulary words, and then you start coming being able to produce some phrases besides just donde está. You're now saying useful small phrases and being able to combine a couple words here and there. Not really in a sentence, but you've got some early production going on, and that's the second phase. So if you've moved on from silent and receptive to production, you've moved on to the second stage. The third stage is speech emergence or production. And now this is where all of a sudden you can start putting some sentences, some basic sentences together. And this generally means you've learned thousands of words in that language. It's hard to communicate at all in any language if you don't have at least 1,000 or 2,000 words in your command. If you can't command 1,000 words, verbs, nouns, prepositions, adjectives, if you can't put those 1,000 words on the table as far as being able to conjugate, and then you're not really going to be able to say anything. So that stage 3 means you've got those, and you can start putting some basic sentences and phrases together, and being able to connect words and phrases to make in a meaningful way to communicate. And so when I was learning my Dutch, right? It is exciting when you're able to do this. And I remember talking to another 19-year-old, another kid, as we were doing this, and he was talking about how he felt so much more comfortable just listening, and he could understand a lot. It was just hard to produce. And it turns out that is the case for almost everyone, right? And that's what these phases are showing, is you get accustomed to hearing and being able to, okay, I understand what they were saying. Even if you don't catch everything, right, you can catch the meaning, as opposed to when you have to produce, all of that goes out the window. Can't just passively say, I get what you're saying. Now it's up, the production relies on your ability to conjugate and put syntax together, and words and phrases being pulled in to form meaning. So the fourth stage of acquisition is intermediate fluency. And so this is where you've now taken it from small sentences, simple phrases, to actually being able to communicate and have a conversation, right? You're actually now communicating in complex sentences with subordinating conjunctions and all those other things. And now you can actually start thinking in that language, and that's always fun, right? I remember one of the first times I dreamed in Dutch, right? That's awesome, because all of a sudden you're now like, okay, like even my subconscious is aware that I can put thoughts together in that language. So that's an exciting level. It does take a lot of work to get there. So in my experience, if you go back to what we were just talking about as far as how long will it take, you're not getting to intermediate fluency until probably 3/4 of the way through that time that we listed, right? You're not really able to communicate at that level without, hundreds, if not, depending obviously on the category of the language difficulty, but hundreds of hours of work, and that is that's when I think that's probably the most exciting part of it. So that's what the payoff is when you can go to that country, wherever it is, or with that group of people, whoever it is, and then you can feel like you can actually discuss things with them. Maybe not everything, probably struggle at times, and one of the most things, and let me prepare you before I give you this fifth. I'll give you the fifth one, and then this story that I think every second language learner needs to have in the back of their mind. So the fifth one is continued language development or fluency, and that's just obviously once you can do complex sentences. It's not like there's another level where now all of a sudden you are uber fluent and a native. Eventually, you could potentially get to that level. Honestly, right? But it'll take a long time, and so continued language development or fluency is just, I'm living in the country, I interact with it all the time, I do it in a particular academic field or a particular field of work, and so I have, my vocabulary is massive. Those types of things are what you need in order to really get that next level of fluency and move towards native fluency. Now, back to that story I was telling you about. So all of these things sound great, and when you get this intermediate fluency I was discussing, it's very exciting. You think you can discuss with someone. I remember in Suriname, I was there. I was discussing something with someone. I felt like I was doing a great job. I was really putting meaning together, and I thought, oh, I'm really doing a good job. And I remember them looking at me, this lady I was talking with, and they turned to the guy I was with, who was also a church missionary, and said, I don't speak English, so can you explain to me what he just said? Bear in mind, I was not speaking English. I was speaking Dutch. But apparently so badly, and so incorrectly, that they actually thought I was speaking English. Because whatever was coming out of my mouth didn't make any sense. So that didn't just happen to me, right? A lot of people I interacted with had that same L2 experience where they felt like they were at this intermediate fluency level. They're interacting with people. They're able to do all of these things. And then all of a sudden they get this gut check of, oh, actually, you were really still pretty bad at this. You conjugate all of your verbs incorrectly, or your pronunciation is so bad that I can't tell what you're saying half of the time. So be ready for that. Take it in stride. Recognize it's just another stage in development. Move forward, and then and don't be offended by the idea that obviously one of the things I'm about to talk about here is what is language transfer. So that is, and that's this idea that when I'm learning my second language, whatever I learned in my first language, whatever my first language is, it's going to impact both how I learn and how I produce that second language for a long time, if not forever, right? Until I'm purely thinking in my L2 and that I go about a full day in that L2 or a week or whatever, my L1 is still having a lot of impact on that L2. I think about it, I translate from L1 to L2, right? I'm going from an English sentence to a Dutch sentence. I'm not just producing a Dutch sentence spontaneously. My English syntax is messing up my Dutch syntax. My American accent is messing up my Dutch. All of those things is language transfer, right? And that's what you don't get in your L1. Babies aren't you don't have a baby accent, right? They might not be able to produce particular sounds, but that's different than having goo goo gaga somehow influence the way that they produce their actual L1, right? But once we've learned the first language, the second language, unless you're learning them simultaneously, and that does happen, right? Kids that grow up in bilingual households, they're truly bilingual, right? No L1 because they're both L1. And they generally take a longer time to learn their first languages because there are two of them, and it takes them longer to really, they're not saying words as quickly, they're not putting sentences together as quickly as purely monolingual speakers are, because they're dealing with two languages inside of their head. That's challenging even for a baby. But generally when they do get it, obviously then they are fully bilingual, right? They're as comfortable in Korean as they are in English, or they're as comfortable in Chinese as they are in Japanese, or whatever other, their two languages that they grew up with. They don't feel more comfortable in one language or another. Maybe eventually they will. They'll pick one, right? But at the baby level, they can do both. So, but language transfer is a real thing for most of us second language learners. The other thing is age and ability really do play an impact. Some people are just better at learning a second language. It has to do with some cognitive abilities, just like some people are better at doing calculus, right? There's just some innate ability for some people to pick up on conjugation and syntax and accents and all of those things, and you'll see that, right? And sometimes it's daunting, but once again, you did it in math class, right? You had that kid that was always better than you, and she or he was frustrating, but you moved along and you did your thing, so do it again, right? Recognize that just because someone else is better than you with that learning a language doesn't mean that you can't also achieve. And then your age. And you've heard this, I'm sure, before, and that there's a critical time to learn a second language, and by the time, if that window shuts, it's going to be hard to learn a second language. That is true-ish, right? There is a critical time to learn language, meaning it's easier, and the L1 transfer to the L2 is not as severe, because your mind is still malleable, a little bit more, a little plastic, and so you're able to put uh, the words, the L2 languages and thoughts, kind of separate them easier from your L1. It is not the case, however, that you cannot learn a second language even to almost native fluency beyond that window. It's just harder. And it's true all the way up until you're 70, 80 years old, right? You can still do it. It's just harder, right? You've got to put more time, you've got to put more effort, you've got to put more structure, and that's what hopefully this podcast is about, is giving you all of the ideas and tools that you might need, the resources you have to go grab yourself, right? But hopefully this can teach you what you might need. You need a vocabulary book? Sure you do. But you also need a class, and you need an app, and you need a reason, and you need all of these different things. And then you need to be patient, and then you'll achieve. So a couple last things we wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about was general patterns of acquisition. It turns out that most people learn particular word endings, like conjugations, in a particular order when you're learning English, right? So non-native English speakers generally learn particular word endings first. You can imagine the more common ones. Makes sense, right? And so here years ago, decades ago, there was this second language researcher that theorized that there was this hard and fast order of acquisition of be it morphology, and that's once again word endings, or syntax. There's a way that everyone acquires the second language. And there is general rules. Statistically, you can make that case, but it is not hard and fast, and it's not the case that everyone learns those things in the exact same order. It happens in different rates, and there is some variability in the order that you acquire different word endings, or the ability to use particular structures, grammatical structures. It's not like everyone acquires the exact same grammatical structures in the same order as you're learning a second language, predictably, and a kind of common sense would tell you that as well, right? But for a while in second language acquisition, that was what they believed. And there is kind of, like I said, still an order of general acquisition, and that's generally dictated by frequency, honestly. And so language frequency, word frequency, grammar frequency, all of those things matter, right? You can get a verb book that gives you the 200 most common verbs. Those are the ones you need to learn, turns out. And those are the ones that you generally will learn. That's the idea, is even if you're just exposing yourself to reading a book or listening to a podcast, those are the ones you're going to hear the most often. Therefore, your brain grabs them, has instances of them, and generalizes from them. Your brain is good at this. Obviously, like I said, as it gets older, maybe not quite as good, but still good. And it is good at grabbing instances and generalizing. So last thing I want to discuss was language testing. And so this is once now you learn a second language and you want to know, okay, well, I feel like I'm pretty good. How good am I? So ask yourself, how do I test my oral ability? And that is that's a good question, right? It's one thing to be able to test reading or writing. Those types of things are pretty clear cut, right? Can I read it? Can I answer questions about it? Can I write a sentence? Can I either spelling, or if it's a different alphabet, do I know how to write that alphabet? But how do I test oral ability? So one of the difficult things you run into is sparseness. If you're thinking, oh, well, I just sit down with someone that knows the language and they'll interview me and then they'll be able to tell me how good I am. And that's generally the idea, and it has been for decades, centuries even, of language testing is that's how we tell whether or not someone's good at a language. They have a rubric, they look for specific things, and they sit down and they interview you. And that's a proficiency interview, an oral proficiency interview. However, one of the issues you run into is it's even if with the rubric and even with a good tester, there's this issue of sparseness, and that's I don't have all the time in the world to test you in all the different ways that oral production matters in first language. I don't have 8 hours to test you, right? You have a half an hour interview, and if you're good at controlling a conversation, limited oral proficiency doesn't necessarily come out completely. At some degree, you'll probably be able to tell, okay, well, they don't have great control of it, but you can kind of fake it in some cases if you can control the conversation a particular way. So that's this idea of sparseness. I don't have all the time, therefore I don't have all the data, and if I don't have all the data, I can't make all the assumptions, I can't draw all the conclusions. And that's where my pet discussion of elicited imitation comes in. And once again, this has come up in many podcasts in the past. Elicited imitation is literally just say and listen and repeat. So I hear a sentence and I have to produce it. And that is different than oral production, right, to some degree. And so it's not perfectly aligned with oral proficiency, but it gets you away from this sparseness issue, where now I can specifically test you on grammar, a particular grammar principle I'm trying to get at, right? Because I will say it to you, and the idea is if I say it to you, and I give you the right length of a sentence, say 8 words, I want an 8-word sentence, and none of the words are too difficult, right? Because if I make the words too difficult, if the lexile, the word density, meaning it's really hard, like they're all academic words, if it's not that, and I'm just looking at this grammar thing, and I say it to you, if you have acquired that ability to understand that piece of grammar, you will be able to reproduce it, right? Your mind will be able to pull it back. Even just hearing it one time, you'll be able to say it right back. And people that have not acquired that grammar structure will not have that ability, right? Their brain will not be able to process that correctly. So then it's just a sequence of sounds to them, right? And if it's 8 words, so that's 10 or 11 syllables, your brain does not have the ability to memorize 10 or 11 syllables on the fly and reproduce them. At least most people cannot. And therefore, the tester can know, okay, this language learner does not have the ability to understand that grammar piece because it didn't mean anything to them, therefore they could not repeat it. If it did mean something to them, then they abstracted to meaning, and once they went to meaning, they were able to chunk it differently in their memory, and then they were able to put it right back into language because it wasn't just arbitrary sounds that they were hearing, it was actually meaningful sounds. And that's elicited imitation's general promise, is the ability to target particular areas and say, okay, well, how good am I at the language? Well, let's find out based on looking at specific parts of the language. There are a lot of other ways to test yourself, right? And I think one of the best ones is my wife and I were recently in Mexico. We went to Sam's Club, because of course we did. And we were trying to buy something. And I was trying to figure out if I could use the Sam's Club app on my phone. I was failing miserably. And so I thought, you know what, I've done some very basic Spanish. Let me go see if I can talk with someone here, and maybe someone here speaks English. Turned out no one there spoke almost any English, which was awesome. I loved that because it made me really try hard with my Spanish. Failed spectacularly, in as much as I never got to use the app. I understood that from the other people that I couldn't use the app, but it was lost on me why I couldn't. Anyway, but putting myself in that situation, that's one of the best ways to test yourself, is, once again, what's your goal? If your goal is to be able to communicate, right, then go to Sam's Club. If your goal is to be able to go to university there, go sit in and audit a class, or go to, or if your goal is to help some refugees, go and do that. Whatever it is, make that happen. So I hope this podcast has been useful. Hope your second language acquisition goes well, and I hope enough Danish people listen that it forces me to learn Danish, because I'd really love to, but I need a reason. So give me a reason, all of you Danes, and I will talk to you later.